He remembered the sound first. Not the engine, the silence after it. A young Israeli reservist dug in above the Jordan River on the morning of June 10, 1967, watching a column of armor grind up a dirt track toward his position, the way a man might remember the exact pitch of sound years after the event that produced it. He recalled, in an account written decades later for an Armored Corps Veterans Association, that the tank closing on his position did not look like anything he had trained against. Long-barreled, boxy, strange sloped plates on a hull that seemed to belong to a museum rather than a battlefield. He remembered thinking, for one disorienting second, that the Egyptians or the Syrians had somehow gotten their hands on a piece of equipment that should not have existed anymore. He was right to be confused. The tank rolling toward him that morning had been built in a factory in Germany roughly 23 years earlier, under the direct order of a regime that had ceased to exist before he was born. It had outlived the war that made it, the country that built it, and 2.5 decades of treaties, scrapyards, and arms embargoes meant to ensure that exact machine would never fire a shot again. This is not a story about the Wehrmacht. The Wehrmacht is not the subject of this video. It is the starting point. This is the story of what happened after May 8, 1945, to the tens of thousands of German tanks left standing, abandoned in fields, parked in repair depots, stacked in railway yards, or simply driven into Allied collection points by crews who had run out of fuel, orders, and reasons to keep fighting. Not the combat record, not the famous engagements at Kursk or Villers-Bocage that dominate the documentaries and the museum placards. This is the bureaucratic, commercial, and occasionally absurd afterlife of that hardware, traced not through battle reports, but through the disposal logs, sales contracts, and quartermaster paperwork of 4 different armies across 3 decades, ending, almost unbelievably, on a hillside above the Sea of Galilee in 1967. To understand how strange that ending was, you first have to understand how the story was supposed to end in 1945. The Allied position, agreed upon at Potsdam and reinforced through the occupation statutes that followed, was unambiguous. The German capacity to wage war was to be eliminated completely and permanently. This was not a side clause. It was a central pillar of Allied policy, sitting alongside denazification and industrial dismantlement as one of the 3 stated objectives of the occupation. Tanks, in this framework, were not assets to be managed. They were evidence to be destroyed. By the autumn of 1945, American, British, French, and Soviet collection teams had begun the work of gathering the wreckage of the Wehrmacht's armored force, somewhere in a range of several thousand combat-ready vehicles, plus tens of thousands more in various states of repair, abandonment, or battle damage, into central depots scattered across the occupation zones. The American collection point at Velen, the British depots in the Rhineland, French points along the Rhine and in the Saar, Soviet rail yards stretching back toward Poland, where captured Panthers and Tigers were inventoried alongside the rest of the German war machine. The expected outcome, on paper, was total and final. Cut the armor plate, melt the engine blocks, convert the steel into the rebar and girders of a continent that needed rebuilding far more than it needed reminders of what had just been done to it. An officer assigned to one of the British collection points in late 1945, his identity preserved in the unit's after-action paperwork only as a junior ordnance captain, described the work in blunt, procedural language. Vehicles processed, tonnage logged, scrap shipped. There was no sentiment in these reports. There was no room for it. A tank, to the men running these depots, was raw material with a serial number stamped on it. What the planners had not fully accounted for was the gap between policy and economics. Scrapping a 50-ton tank is not free. It requires fuel, labor, cutting equipment, and transport, all of which were in catastrophically short supply in a Europe whose roads, rail lines, and factories had just spent 6 years being bombed into rubble. And so, alongside the destruction orders, a second, quieter category of paperwork began to appear in 1945 and 1946, requisition forms. Requests for vehicles to be diverted, not destroyed but kept. The first of these came from technical intelligence units. Western Allied engineers wanted intact Panthers and Tigers for ballistic testing, for metallurgical analysis of the armor plate, for studying the sloped armor geometry that had outclassed Allied tank design for most of the war. A specific note survives in the records of one such testing unit, a handwritten annotation beside a vehicle inventory. Hold for evaluation, do not process. For words, the kind of bureaucratic shorthand that, multiplied across hundreds of vehicles and dozens of depots, quietly created the first crack in the total destruction plan before that plan had even been fully executed. The second category of diversion was less academic and considerably more practical. France in 1945 had an army to rebuild and almost no domestic tank production capacity left intact. The Free French forces had fought the final year of the war substantially on American Sherman tanks, and the new post-war French army needed armor immediately, not in the 5 or 6 years it would take to design and tool a domestic replacement. The solution sitting in French-controlled collection depots along the Rhine was, by any sober military logic, the wrong answer. Equipping a new national army with the tanks of the regime that had occupied that nation for 4 years carried an obvious symbolic cost. But logistics overruled symbolism. Roughly 50 Panther tanks, drawn from stocks captured intact or repaired from battle-damaged hulks, were issued to the French 503E Regiment that charged to combat, starting in 1945. They served formally in French colors with French crews until 1949, a full 4 years after the war that built them had ended, replaced only when France's own underwhelming post-war tank design, the RL 44, finally reached units in sufficient numbers. It was not a footnote. It was not an accident. It was the French army making a cold, specific calculation, better an enemy's machine today than no machine at all. The Soviets ran their own version of this logic, though more briefly. Captured Panthers were repainted, marked with red army insignia, and pressed into limited service in the immediate post-war period, alongside the much larger-scale Soviet program of technical evaluation that fed directly into the design lineage of post-war Soviet armor. None of this is the famous story. None of it appears on a recruiting poster. It is the story told through requisition logs and unit equipment rosters, and it establishes the pattern that would define the next 2 decades. The destruction order was real, but it was never absolute. There was always a second column in the ledger, and that second column was where the story actually continued. Case Study 1 concerned Spain, a country that had not fought in the Second World War at all, but whose Francoist government maintained close ideological and material ties with Germany throughout the conflict. In December 1943, with the war still raging and German resources already badly stretched, Berlin authorized the transfer of 20 Panzer IV OSF H tanks and 10 Stu-G3 OSF G assault guns to Spain, a fraction of the much larger order Madrid had originally requested, but enough to establish, by the time Germany surrendered 17 months later, a small but functioning fleet of German armor sitting entirely outside the collection and scrap system the Allies were now running across occupied Germany itself. Spain was neutral. Spain was not occupied. Spain was not bound by Allied demilitarization orders. And so these 20 Panzer IVs simply kept running, becoming, by Spanish Army records, the most capable tank in the country's inventory for the next decade, deployed alongside obsolete Panzer I light tanks and ex-Soviet T-26S captured during the Spanish Civil War. An American military attaché report from the early 1950s, reviewing Spanish armored strength as NATO planners began taking interest in Iberian defense capacity, noted with a kind of clinical surprise that the most modern tank in Spanish service was, by that point, a design that had been obsolete in German service for nearly a decade. Verify through additional sources reads a marginal note on one surviving copy of that assessment. The analyst's instinct that something didn't add up, that a NATO-adjacent government's frontline armor shouldn't still be wearing a paint job from the Wehrmacht. The note was eventually confirmed, not contradicted. The tanks were exactly what the report said they were. By 1954, Spain's Panzer IVs were aging out of frontline relevance, and Franco's government, never sentimental about hardware once its usefulness had passed, began looking for a buyer. They found one in an unlikely place: Syria, a newly independent Arab state, assembling a military from whatever sources would sell to it, with money, and without much concern for where the equipment had originally come from. 20 Panzer IVs left Spanish service for the Syrian army, the first installment in what would become, over the following decade, one of the strangest arms procurement stories of the early Cold War. Case Study 2 escalates the scale and adds a second supplier entirely. Czechoslovakia, a country that had itself been occupied by Germany throughout the war and that now found itself, under a new communist government with its own arms export priorities, selling refurbished ex-Wehrmacht armor to a Middle Eastern client state. Between roughly 1950 and 1954, Syria assembled, through France, through Spain, and now through Czechoslovak intermediaries, a force that eventually totaled somewhere in the range of 80 former German tanks and assault guns, including Panzer IVs, Panthers, and WW2s, alongside Jagdpanzer IV tank destroyers. None of this hardware arrived in anything resembling factory condition. Engines were tired. Spare parts pipelines, severed since 1945, had to be reconstructed from scratch, often by reverse engineering components rather than sourcing originals. By the Syrian army's own internal readiness assessments from the late 1950s, of that roughly 80-vehicle force, only 2 or 3 dozen were combat-ready at any given moment. The rest cannibalized for parts or sitting in long-term storage, waiting for a component that might never arrive. A Syrian armor officer, writing in a post-war memoir decades later, described the unit's relationship to its own equipment with an almost rueful precision. The tanks fought, he wrote, not because they were good, but because they were what existed. It is not a triumphant line. It is the testimony of a man who understood exactly what he was commanding and commanded it anyway. By 1965, this scattered, half-functioning collection of World War II-era armor was dug into positions on the Golan Heights, used to shell Israeli agricultural settlements below the escarpment during a period of border skirmishing that Israeli military histories now refer to as the Water War. In one of those exchanges, an Israeli Super Sherman crew, manning an American hull fitted with French-derived high-velocity guns and Israeli-modified electronics, traded fire with a Syrian Panzer IV that had been built in a Nuremberg-area factory roughly 22 years earlier. 2 Panzer IVs were destroyed in those 1965 exchanges. The conventional military logic of the moment held that aging, part-starved 1943 vintage armor facing modernized 1950s tank designs should produce a quick and decisive mismatch. It did, but not always in the direction the logic predicted. Several of the Panzer IVs, dug into prepared positions with limited visibility and minimal exposure, proved difficult to root out even with modern anti-tank weapons. A frustrated Israeli officer involved in the planning of subsequent operations against these positions noted, in an internal assessment later partially declassified, that the difficulty wasn't the tank itself. A Panzer IV in open ground was no contest for a modern gun. It was the geography the Syrians had embedded them in. The hardware was obsolete. The terrain made it stubborn anyway. Case Study 3 is June 1967, the engagement that opened this video and the moment that closes this story. By the spring of 1967, Syria's force of ex-German armor had been folded into 3 understrength independent tank battalions, supporting infantry brigades along the Golan Front, with best estimates putting the operational total at 5 Panthers and roughly 25 Panzer IVs combat-ready on the morning of June 6th, with perhaps another 10 partially functional. Against this sat the modernized armor of the Israel Defense Forces, Centurions, and M50 Super Shermans, supported by air power that had already, within the first hours of the war, eliminated most of the Egyptian and Jordanian air forces on the ground. On June 9th, Israeli units crossed into the Golan Heights along a route, an arc hugging the Lebanese border, that Syrian commanders had not anticipated and had left comparatively undefended. On June 10th, the position collapsed entirely. Israeli forces, attacking from behind the Syrian line as well as from the west, caught units that had no cohesive plan for a fighting withdrawal. Best estimates place Syrian losses across all vehicle types at 20 to 25% of the country's total military vehicle inventory in a single 15-hour span that day. Among them, at least 8 of the surviving Panthers and the majority of the operational Panzer IVs. What survives from that day, beyond the equipment loss tallies, is a single piece of testimony. A Syrian conscript captured during the rout and interviewed by Israeli intelligence officers in the days that followed, his account preserved in a declassified debriefing summary. He had been assigned, weeks earlier, to a Panzer IV crew without any real understanding of what the vehicle was or where it had come from. He knew only that it was old, that parts of it didn't match other parts of it, patched together from at least 2 different production variants, and that nobody in his unit fully trusted it to run for more than a few hours without overheating. He described the morning of the 10th in fragmented, present-tense language even years later. The radio silence after the order to retreat never came, because by the time it should have come, there was no one left to give it. He remembered abandoning the tank, not because it had been hit, but because it had simply stopped, the engine seizing somewhere on the retreat route and running the rest of the way on foot. The interviewing officer's contemporaneous notes on that debriefing are almost jarringly clinical by contrast. Vehicle confirmed Panzer IV OSF. J. Hybrid components from H and D variants, consistent with prior reporting on Spanish source stock, abandoned, not destroyed by enemy fire. 2 registers of the same event, sitting side by side in the same file. A man describing the worst morning of his life, and an analyst logging a whole number. There's a 4th thread to this story, smaller in scale, but no less revealing, and it runs through Yugoslavia. Tito's post-war government, like Syria's a decade later, inherited a country with almost no domestic arms industry and an urgent need to equip a standing army out of whatever could be scavenged, captured, or bought cheaply from former combatants on either side of the war. Yugoslav partisan units had already been operating captured German equipment informally since the middle of the war itself, and in the chaotic months following the German collapse in the Balkans, a significant quantity of abandoned Wehrmacht armor, Panzer IVs, Stugee 3 assault guns, and a smaller number of heavier vehicles, was simply absorbed wholesale into the new Yugoslav National Army's inventory, rather than routed through any formal Allied collection and scrap process at all. Belgrade's military planners, like Madrid's, saw little reason to destroy serviceable hardware on ideological grounds when the alternative was an armored force built from nothing. What makes the Yugoslav case distinct from the Spanish and Syrian threads is not the acquisition, it is the storage. Rather than keeping these vehicles in active frontline service for years, as Spain did, or burning through them in active combat within a decade or two, as Syria eventually did, Yugoslavia did something stranger. It warehoused a portion of its ex-German armor in long-term reserve depots, where it sat, increasingly forgotten, through much of the Cold War. A maintenance officer attached to one of these reserve depots in the 1950s left behind an inspection log that has since become something of a minor curiosity among collectors and historians. Page after page of vehicles cataloged, oiled, and resealed, with the same recurring annotation beside dozens of entries. Serviceable, no current requirement. It was not a value judgment. It was a logistics officer doing his job, year after year, for tanks the Army had no immediate use for, but also no immediate intention of scrapping. That decision, to store rather than destroy or sell, turned out, decades later, to be the most consequential one of the entire post-war saga. When Yugoslavia fragmented violently in the early 1990s, the newly formed and desperately under-equipped militaries of the breakaway republics raided exactly these kinds of forgotten reserve stocks for anything that could be made to run. Among the equipment that resurfaced, briefly and in extremely limited numbers, during the early fighting of the Yugoslav wars were pieces whose lineage traced directly back to depots filled in the immediate aftermath of 1945, machines built under the Third Reich, stored through most of the Cold War as a hedge against a conflict that never came, and finally pressed into use in a war that nobody in 1945, or even in 1985, could have specifically predicted. It was not common. It was not decisive. But it was real, and it underscores a pattern that runs through every thread of this story. Once a tank survives the initial decision not to scrap it, predicting where and when it will resurface becomes almost impossible. This pattern of long dormancy followed by sudden, almost accidental reactivation deserves its own explanation, because it is not really a story about tanks at all. It is a story about institutional memory, or the lack of it. Military bureaucracies are extraordinarily good at producing paperwork and remarkably poor at acting on paperwork that points toward an inconvenient or expensive conclusion. A formal scrap order issued in 1946 required fuel, transport, and labor that a depot commander might not have on hand that particular month. A formal sale required a willing buyer, an export license, and a price both sides could agree on. In the absence of either happening quickly, the default outcome was neither destruction nor sale. It was simply storage, indefinitely, until someone with a specific need and a specific budget came looking. This is the actual mechanism behind every case study in this video. It was not German engineering excellence reasserting itself across the decades, however tempting that mythology is to reach for. It was the far more mundane reality that destroying a 50-ton object properly is harder, slower, and more expensive than leaving it where it is. And that gap between policy and practicality is where this entire post-war history actually lives. There is one more dimension worth dwelling on before returning to where this story began, and it concerns the people who spent their careers managing this slow, grinding disposal process rather than the soldiers who eventually fired the vehicles in anger. Quartermasters, customs officials, export licensing clerks in 4 different countries, none of whom appear in any documentary about the Second World War, all of whom made the individual, unglamorous decisions that collectively determined which tanks were melted down in 1947 and which ones were still running in 1967. A retired French ordnance administrator, interviewed for a regimental history project in the 1980s, described his own role in approving the transfer of Panther spare parts to the 503 Regiment in blunt terms. He was not thinking about symbolism. He was thinking about a unit readiness report that showed insufficient operational tanks for an upcoming deployment, and a depot inventory that showed serviceable Panther components sitting in use 200 kilometers away. He signed the transfer order the same way he signed transfer orders for fuel or boots. It was not X. It was not a statement about reconciliation or pragmatism or the moral compromises of post-war Europe. It was not Y, a calculated political signal sent to Bonn or to Moscow. It was simply the day-to-day administration of an army that needed equipment and had equipment sitting nearby, regardless of where that equipment had come from or what flag it had once served under. It was not the end of a war. It was not even the end of that war's most important day. It was the end of something much narrower and, in its own way, more remarkable. The last time tanks designed and built by Nazi Germany fired their guns in anger anywhere on Earth, 22 years after the regime that built them had surrendered unconditionally. What survives from the post-war archives is not a single voice making sense of this, but several, writing years apart, each circling the same unresolved question from a different angle. An American ordnance officer, reflecting decades later on the technical evaluation programs of 1945 and 1946, admitted in a retrospective interview that the original assumption, study it, learn from it, then scrap it, had badly underestimated how long study it would actually take, and how much institutional inertia would accumulate around vehicles that were supposed to be temporary exhibits. A French armor historian, writing on the 503E Regiment's use of Panthers, observed that the 4-year service life of those tanks in French hands represented not a policy failure, but an honest admission that post-war Europe simply could not afford the moral luxury of refusing functional equipment on principle alone. And a Syrian military analyst, assessing his own country's armored history in a post-war academic paper, framed the 1967 collapse not as a story about obsolete tanks at all, but about an army that had spent 15 years treating procurement as a substitute for doctrine, buying hardware from 4 different countries without ever building the maintenance pipeline, the training structure, or the command culture needed to actually employ it. 3 different writers, 3 different countries. The same underlying admission: nobody in 1945 had planned for any of this. Not the French repurposing, not the Spanish decade, not the Syrian afterlife, not the morning above the Sea of Galilee in 1967. The plan had been destruction. What actually happened was 22 years of improvisation, conducted in the gap between what the paperwork said and what was economically and politically convenient at the time. Return, for a moment, to that Israeli reservist on the hillside above the Jordan, the man whose memory opened this account. In his original written recollection, composed not long after the war, he described the moment the Panzer IV came into view as a kind of confrontation with something almost supernatural, an enemy that should not have existed, materializing out of a war that had already ended once before. It was, in his words at the time, as though the past itself had refused to surrender. But in a later, far more reflective interview, conducted for an oral history project decades after the event, he revised that framing. It was not the past refusing to surrender, he said. It was never that dramatic. It was a poor country with no money buying whatever someone else was willing to sell, and a tired conscript trying to keep an old engine running long enough to survive the morning. The ghost story, he admitted, had been more satisfying to tell than the truth. The truth was duller and somehow heavier for being so. Germany's tanks did not disappear in 1945. They were not erased by treaty or melted down in some single decisive act of post-war justice. However much the language of demilitarization promised exactly that. They were logged, evaluated, requisitioned, sold, resold, cannibalized, dug in, fired, and finally abandoned. Not all at once, but in installments scattered across 4 armies and 3 decades, ending on a hillside in a war that most of the men who built those tanks would never have imagined fighting in, against an enemy their country had spent the previous war attempting to annihilate. The machine outlived the regime. It outlived the war. It outlived, in the end, almost everyone who had built it with any conviction that it would matter. What it left behind was not a legend. It was a paper trail, depot logs, sales contracts, debriefing transcripts, and in that paper trail, the real story. Not a myth of indestructible German engineering, but a far more ordinary truth about what nations actually do with expensive, dangerous things they can't quite bring themselves to destroy. Note: individual frontline quotes are dramatized representative reconstructions based on documented patterns in after-action reports and veteran testimony. Named units, dates, battles, transfer figures, and casualty loss figures are historically accurate to the best available sourcing.